Thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. Today's podcast is from June 4th, 2017. We continue our study in the Gospel of John with Pastor Dax.
So we've been in John's Gospel now for a while. Do you remember how it ended last week in John chapter 9? Remember John chapter 9 starts out with this blind man who's healed. He's given his sight by Jesus physically. But then also at the end of John 9, the man is given his spiritual sight, right? And he becomes a worshiper of Jesus. He worships Jesus. And at the same time, the Pharisees, who think they're the only ones who can see what's going on, they're confirmed to be in their state of spiritual blindness, and they reject Jesus. I mean, there really couldn't be a greater division than that at the end of John 9. And in this passage before us today, in John 10, we're going to look at the first 21 verses. It ends in the same way, with division. And that's the pattern in John's gospel, is that Jesus comes and he does a sign, then he has a dialogue, and that ends with division. And we're going to do something different this morning. We're going to look at the end of this story first, because I want you to see this in verses 19 through 21 of chapter 10. John 10, verse 19. There was again a division among the Jews, meaning the Pharisees, because of these words. Many of them said, "He has a demon and is insane. Why listen to him?" And so they're echoing the conclusion from John chapter 8 when they say that. Others said, "These are not the words of one who is oppressed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind?" So they're echoing the division from John chapter 9. It's the same conversation here building on itself. Division. Either Jesus is insane or he is God. There's no middle ground here. And what prompts this division? Look at the text there in verse 19. There was a division again among the Jews because of these words. Jesus' words cause division. So what we want to do is take a look at these words in this passage today. And John's intention in recording these words for us, for you, is that you would pick a side. And John's hope is that you would believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So notice this opening illustration that Jesus comes out with here in verses 1 through 6. I want to read that whole passage. Chapter 10, verses 1 through 6. Truly, truly, I say to you. Okay, so remember, when he uses that phrase, right, that's a cue that he's about to say something groundbreaking, something new. You need to listen up. Truly, truly, I say to you. And we need to ask, I suppose, who's the you here? Who's he talking to? Well, it's the same people that he's been talking to. If you have your Bible open and you look at the end of chapter 9, verse 40, it's the Pharisees who say to him, Are we also blind? And Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains." And now, ignore the chapter break. He continues now in the very next sentence. Okay, same conversation. "Truly, truly, I say to you," speaking to the Pharisees, "he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers." So what in the world is Jesus talking about here? I mean, look at all the different characters and elements of this word picture. Right? You have a thief and a robber, a door, a shepherd, some sheep, a gatekeeper, strangers. There's a lot going on here, a lot of moving parts, and Jesus is not very explicit about what it all means. He's not as clear as he could be. Why not? Well, remember, chapter 9 ended with the Pharisees claiming they could see, and now Jesus he's drawing them a picture. You can think of it as a vision test. He's going to see just how true their claim is that they can see here. Now, certainly the detailed imagery of a sheepfold and how that all worked, that would be very familiar to Jesus' audience here. This wouldn't be unfamiliar territory. But what should also be familiar, especially to the Pharisees here, are the words of God spoken through the prophet Ezekiel. And in Ezekiel 34, just listen to the rebuke that God gives the religious leaders of Ezekiel's day. In Ezekiel 34, God says, "Ah, shepherds of Israel, who have been feeding yourselves, should not the shepherds feed the sheep? You eat the fat, you clothe yourselves with wool, you slaughter the fat ones, but you do not feed the sheep. The weak you have not strengthened, the sick you have not healed, the injured you have not bound up, the strayed you have not brought back, the lost you have not sought, and with force and harshness you have ruled them. So they were scattered, because there was no shepherd, and they became food for all the wild beasts. My sheep, God's sheep, were scattered over all the face of the earth with none to search or seek for them." That's a stinging rebuke. So, back to John 10. Who are these thieves and robbers and the stranger that Jesus speaks of? The context makes it very clear. The thief, the robber, the stranger, this is a reference to the Pharisees, to the religious leaders, to the shepherds who were feeding themselves. They were more interested in fleecing the sheep than in nurturing and guiding and guarding the sheep. They're unauthorized to enter the sheepfold. And when they do, it's only to brutalize and abuse the sheep. Now, contrast that image with the shepherd in Jesus' word picture here, who comes to the door, who's recognized by the gatekeeper and by his own sheep, and he leads those sheep out then for their own good. Now, you don't want to get too far ahead of yourself in the story. At this point, as Jesus is just giving us these first few verses, he doesn't come right out and identify himself as the shepherd. Not yet. But then again, what does he just finish doing in John chapter 9? He's called out a blind man to himself, and he's transformed that blind man into a worshiper. The Pharisees, on the other hand, have reviled that same blind man and excommunicated him from the synagogue. Remember? So this little word picture here, all it is a reflection of reality. This is what has just happened. And just look more closely at how Jesus describes the way the shepherd gathers his flock here. So he enters legitimately through the door, the main door of the sheepfold. Then it says, the sheep hear his voice. So that means the shepherd is calling out to them. To all the sheep in the fold? Is he calling out to all the sheep in the fold? No. Look what it says. He calls his own sheep, which suggests there are different flocks in this sheepfold. And notice he calls his own sheep by name, individually, by name. And what this is saying is he's coming to the sheep pen of Judaism, the Pharisees, the religious system, and he's calling out his own flock out of that harsh system. And notice how they belong to him before he calls them. And then it says he leads them out. And that calls to mind Numbers 27, where Moses is praying for a successor. It says in Numbers 27, somebody who will lead the people of God in and out so that they will not be like sheep without a shepherd. And then I think it's interesting in the very next verse there in Numbers 27, that successor is identified. It's going to be Yeshua. Joshua, or the Greek version of that is Jesus. And then, verse 4, notice after he's brought his sheep out of the fold, he goes ahead of them to lead them. And his sheep follow him simply because they know his voice. On the other hand, they won't follow the voice of a stranger. In fact, they'll run from that voice, it says, because they do not know it. So this is the picture that Jesus is drawing for the Pharisees here, okay? And it's a vision test of sorts. You say you can see. Let's see how clearly you really can see. How do they do? Verse 6. This figure of speech Jesus used with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. How could they? They're blind. They're not of his flock. Their guilt remains, as he says at the end of chapter 9. Verse 7, so Jesus again said to them. Okay, so he's going to elaborate now for them. Since they're not getting what he said in his opening illustration, he's going to expand his explanation of that illustration for them. And in this explanation now, Jesus is going to make two more of those famous I am statements. I am, that clear reference back to the divine name of God, Yahweh. Both of these claims here that he says, he'll repeat each of them twice. I am the door, I am the good shepherd. They are both exclusive claims to be God. So it says, Jesus again said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, there's that phrase again, right? It means listen up. Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. So notice here how he expands this metaphor, right? Gone now is the gatekeeper. And now the sheep in this pen, they all belong to the shepherd. And rather than just leading the sheep out, now the shepherd leads them both in and out. And notice, Jesus isn't just the shepherd that enters by the door, he is the door. And like I said, that's an exclusive claim. Later on in this gospel, in John 14:6, Jesus will say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. In the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus is speaking of entering God's kingdom, he uses that image of a door or a gate, where he says, enter by the narrow gate. For the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. And we can really see how exclusive, how narrow this claim is if we look at two contrasts and two promises in this little section, okay? So the first contrast is in verse 8. Jesus says, all who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. And so really here he's probably looking beyond even just the local synagogue leaders, these Pharisees. Probably even in scope here is all of the messianic pretenders, all of the people who had come forward claiming to be the Messiah, who had led the people astray. They promised their followers freedom, but instead they led them into destruction. And Jesus is saying, I'm the true Messiah. The way that I will be victorious will not be through armed conflict. It will be by myself dying in your place. And now out of that contrast here with these thieves and robbers, look at the promise he makes in verse 9. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, here's the promise, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. So Jesus is the exclusive means by which his flock may enter the safety of the sheepfold and go out to find nourishment. Jesus alone, in other words, offers spiritual protection and spiritual provision for his sheep. So that's the first contrast and promise. And now there's a second contrast in verse 10. The thief, again, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. So if we're right, if he is talking about other messianic pretenders, we can relate to that. There's many so-called saviors that we place our hope in who may promise us protection, provision, but their agenda is very different than the agenda of the shepherd, right? Just think about the world leaders in history. They steal time, money, property. They kill, displaying little to no regard for human life. They destroy morals, cultures, legacies, beliefs, whatever is of value. And there's a trail of trampled and abused sheep that are left in their wake. And now notice how Jesus' second promise stands in contrast to that. Still in verse 10, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. If your picture of Christianity is that you are called to now a list of do's and do nots, and you have to walk around with a sour expression on your face all the time, I want you to read that verse again. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. Okay, so Jesus calls his followers not to a miserable, suffocating existence, but to a rich, full, joyful, meaningful life in him. An abundant life, a life that satisfies the deepest needs and longings of your soul. But there's only one way to receive that kind of abundant life. There's only one basis for the spiritual security that Jesus promises. Only one source of spiritual nourishment. Only one way to enter God's eternal kingdom. Jesus alone. To have this kind of abundant life, you must enter by him. That's the first part of his sort of expanded explanation here. He is the door. That's the first part. Here's the second part. Verse 11. I am the good shepherd. So if we're tracking here with this passage, all right, verses 1 through 5, Jesus is gathering his flock. He's gathering them for the purpose of eternal protection and provision. That's verses 7 through 10. And now, in verses 11 through 18, we're going to see how he, as the good shepherd, how he goes about gathering that flock and giving them abundant life. This is how it happens. Okay, and just a heads up, we're about to push out into some deep waters here. Okay, but that's good. Because if you just always stay in the shallow end of the pool, you're not going to learn how to swim out in the deeps. You're not going to have the strength to do it. So we need to push out into the deep once in a while. And as we'll see, this is not just a academic theological exercise to push out into the deep. This is something that should elicit worship, praise, joy for the greatness of what God has done for you. So first of all, notice there in verse 11, I am the good shepherd. That word good, kalos in the Greek, good doesn't do it justice. It carries the weight of nobility or worth. And so the picture here is not of Jesus as a, kind of sentimental, maybe even slightly effeminate shepherd with a bunch of fluffy lambs in his arms. Okay? The duty of a shepherd was tiring, dangerous at times. Remember before David was a king, he was a shepherd. And we're told he even fought off lions and bears to protect his flock. Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. I am the noble shepherd. I am the worthy shepherd. I am the true shepherd, is what he means. So how does this good shepherd gather his flock and give them abundant life? The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. That's how. And at this point, it simply means he's prepared to do so. He's willing to risk his life for the sheep, just like David was willing to risk his life against bears and lions for his flock. But that's where the metaphor starts to break down a little bit. Because it would never be the intention of an ordinary shepherd to actually die while protecting his flock, because if he actually died, that's going to leave the whole flock exposed, unprotected. But Jesus doesn't just merely risk his life. He actually lays it down. In fact, if you look there in these 8 verses here, look at the emphasis on this. 5 times in these 8 verses, he says, I lay down my life. I lay down my life. I lay it down. I lay it down. So far from being a tragic accident or an unforeseen casualty, Jesus laying his life down is precisely what qualifies him to be the good shepherd. It's why the author of Hebrews refers to him as the great shepherd of the sheep. And when he lays down his life, not only is his flock not exposed to further threats, when he lays down his life, he actually draws his sheep to himself and he saves them through his death. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And notice another contrast here now in verse 12. He who's a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. So Jesus continues to expand this metaphor, to push it out, and he introduces a new character here, the hired hand. Now, the hired hand, he's not necessarily wicked like the thief and the robber. The hired hand is more just selfish, self-centered even. I mean, as long as there's no personal risk to him, he's happy to do his job and get paid. But if danger approaches, then you better believe he's going to save his own skin first and leave the sheep to fend for themselves. The hired hand is there to remind us, I think, of everything that the good shepherd is not. And notice the repetition in verse 14. Jesus repeats, I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. So in verses 3 and 4, if you remember back up there, we've already been introduced to this idea that there's an intimate knowledge shared between the good shepherd and the sheep. But notice here in verse 14 what that intimate knowledge is based on, what it's grounded in. So how intimately, how well does the good shepherd know his sheep and vice versa? Well, according to verse 14, you could ask, how intimately do God the Father and God the Son know each other? That's startling. To think that you have that same relationship that's been shared in eternity past between God the Father and God the Son, that mirrors the relationship that you have with your shepherd. That should tell you there's something unique and special about the relationship that Jesus has with his sheep. And did you catch it there in verse 11? The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And again here in verse 15, I lay down my life for the sheep. This is particular. This is specific. Who does the good shepherd lay down his life for? The sheep. All the sheep in the fold? No. The context makes it clear. These are the same sheep who belong to him. These are the sheep who hear his voice. These are the sheep that he calls by name. These are the sheep that follow him. These are the sheep that he leads in and out. These are the sheep that he protects and provides for. These are the sheep for whom he lays down his life. In other words, when he lays down his life, he's actually paying the price for those sheep. This is an actual atonement, not just a potential atonement that creates the possibility of being a sheep, that you somehow make that real by believing. No, Jesus' death actually satisfied God's wrath. It actually paid in full the penalty for his sheep, whom he calls out by name. So how does that happen? Well, let's look at what the text says. I lay down my life for the sheep. Now that word translated for is the Greek word huper. It literally means, get this, for. It's a fairly common word. But here's the thing. Almost always when John uses this word huper in his gospel, it's nearly always 11 out of 13 times in the context of sacrifice. It's a sacrificial word. It's a substitutionary word. So, for example, back in John 6, when Jesus says, I'm the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. Sacrifice. Or we'll see in a few weeks, longer than that. Chapter 15, Jesus says, greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. See how that word's being used? Same usage here. It's almost always used in a sacrificial context. So when Jesus says here, I lay down my life for the sheep, that means he's not just setting an example. He's not just creating the possibility of saving his sheep. His death is substitutionary. His death is sacrificial. It is for his sheep. He lays down his life to defend the sheep, and through his death, his sheep are actually saved. That's what makes him the good shepherd. The shepherd's sacrificial death is what secures the redemption of his sheep. This is done for his sheep, the sheep who belong to him. And that sacrifice is particular and definite and intentional. And moreover, as it says there, the whole thing is grounded in the intimate relationship that Jesus has with his sheep, a relationship that mirrors the eternal relationship that exists between God the Father and God the Son. I told you these are deep waters. Okay, hang on. We'll get through this. And I trust your hearts will be provoked to worship by the time we're done. Notice verse 16. Jesus continues, and I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. Now there's several things in this verse that will help us understand as best we can how the good shepherd gathers his flock. He says, I have other sheep that are not of this fold. What's he saying here? Well, in the immediate context, right, the sheepfold, back in verse 1, it represents Judaism. Jesus calls his own sheep out of that fold of Judaism. And so the reference to another sheepfold then must refer to Gentiles. Okay, so that's kind of the big picture of what's going on here. And that is a big deal. But I want you to notice what he says. I have, past tense, other sheep that are not of this fold. So Jesus knows his sheep, apparently, no matter what fold they're in. But did you catch it here? He has them before they come to him. Before they come to him, he has them. I have other sheep. He hasn't brought them out yet. He's going to call out his sheep from these various sheepfolds, but they already belong to him before he calls them. How can that be? Because these sheep already belong to the Father, and they are given from the Father to the Son. We saw that a few weeks ago back in chapter 6. Remember, Jesus said, all that the Father gives me will come to me. We'll see that next week in verse 29. If you want a sneak preview, you can look down at verse 29. Jesus is still talking about sheep. He says, my Father has given them to me. The sheep first belong to the Father, who gives them to the Son. Or as Paul writes in Ephesians 1, he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless before him. In love, he predestined us for adoption as sons through Jesus Christ. Why did God do that? Paul says, according to the purpose of his will, to the praise of his glorious grace. By his will, for his glory. That's about the best way I can answer that question. So back to verse 16 in chapter 10 there. I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also. You could translate that, it is necessary that I bring them also. This must happen. Why? Well, if we're playing along at home here and we're keeping track, if the Father has chosen the sheep and he gives the sheep to his Son, and Jesus will lay down his life for the sheep, then it becomes unthinkable that what the Father would choose and give to the Son and the Son would die for, that he would fail to bring all the way home. It's unthinkable. There's no question. They must be brought, is what Jesus said. They will be brought. How? How will that happen? By his word. By his calling out to them. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And maybe you're sitting there thinking, I've never heard Jesus' voice. Am I one of his sheep? Well, as long as the word is faithfully being proclaimed, even right now in this moment, you are hearing Jesus' voice through his word. And Jesus' voice is heard through you as you faithfully witness and share the gospel with others. He brings sheep to himself now the same way that he does in this little word picture, by his word, by his voice. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. Do you hear the certainty in that statement? I must bring them, and they will listen to my voice. Jesus has a self-authenticating authority. The reason that they will listen is because he must bring them. For any of us to say that would be a circular argument. For Jesus to say that is just to say that he is the ultimate authority. I must bring them, so they will listen. And he doesn't mean that they're just going to listen and hear him out and then maybe decide to either stay in their current sheepfold or maybe trot over here and join another flock. No, they will listen to my voice means they will respond. This call is effectual. They will come. They will follow. To what end? Why? So that there will be one flock, one shepherd. Hear the authority there again. There will be one flock, one shepherd. Salvation comes from the Jews and it's extended out now to include the Gentiles. In fact, to see this play out, just flip over to John 11 for a second if you have your Bible out. In John 11, towards the end, after Lazarus has been raised, the religious leaders are arguing about what to do with Jesus. And then Caiaphas, the high priest, stands up and says that it's better to kill Jesus rather than let him live and risk the wrath of the Romans. Okay, so then in chapter 11, verse 51, John explains what Caiaphas did. He says, he did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. Jews, Gentiles, one flock, one shepherd. So back to chapter 10, what Jesus says there in verse 16 of chapter 10, it's not just the fulfillment of messianic prophecy. This is the basis for the confidence that we can have in the mission of the church. Do you understand that? I don't want you to miss this. Let me say that again. What Jesus says here in verse 16 is the basis for the confidence that we can have in the mission of the church. Think about it. If Jesus himself must gather his sheep from these other folds, and he will not fail to do that very thing, then what does that mean? It means that the global mission of the church to save God's sheep will succeed. The results are guaranteed here in Hermiston or in Haiti. God is working to save his sheep. The sheep that he chose to give to his Son and for whom the Son lays down his life. And you, Christian, are part of that work if Jesus is your shepherd. Not because you're more worthy or more special than anyone else, right? No, the realization that you belong to the flock of God, the only thing that should result in is ever-increasing humility and ever-increasing gratitude and ever-increasing service. Thanks be to God for his inexpressible gift, as Paul writes. When the good shepherd laid down his life, he did it to purchase his sheep from every tribe and language and people and nation. which means that wherever you are then, even right here, there are people who need to hear the voice of Jesus. The way that they will hear that voice is through your faithful witness to his word. And so because of that great privilege and great responsibility, friends, we dare not let indifference or fear or, God forbid, something like racism hold us back, keep us from sharing the gospel, from being the voice of Jesus for those who need to hear it. Now Jesus starts to wrap this up here, verse 17. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. So it's not that the Father is holding back his love until Jesus agrees to give up his life on the cross. That's not what this is saying. The love of the Father is eternally linked with the perfect obedience of and the dependence that the Son has on the Father. This is huge. What it means is that the love of the Father for the Son and the love of the Son for the Father existed before the love of God for the world, because they existed in eternity past with each other in an eternal loving relationship. And so that means that it's the eternal loving relationship within the Trinity, between Father, Son, and Spirit, that makes God's love for the world possible. It makes salvation possible. It flows out of that. And notice the purpose for which Jesus lays down his life. See it there in verse 17? So that he may take it up again. So he died in order to rise. You get that? His death wasn't the end game. The resurrection was always in view. And through it, he was ultimately glorified. And by it, he caused his sheep to live. And still speaking of his life, Jesus concludes here, verse 18, no one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This charge I have received from my Father. Remarkable statement. And we don't have time to go into it, but who killed Jesus? Didn't his enemies murder him? Well, yes, in one sense, right? And if that's all there was to it, then at best he would just be some sort of heroic martyr to remember. But that's not all there was to it. No part of Jesus' death took place outside of the sovereign plan of God. And then that changes everything, doesn't it? Because it means that the sacrificial death of the shepherd was not bad luck or tragic fate or just some sort of accident of the cosmos. The sacrificial death of the shepherd was the Father's plan. And part of what makes it beautiful is that Jesus, in his humanity, is aware of that plan, and he voluntarily lays down his life of his own accord. That commission that he's received, that charge he's received, and who he's received it from, give him the authority to lay down his life. And not only lay down his life, but to take it back up again. So do you see the sense of oneness there between Father and Son in both the command and in the obedience, the perfect obedience to the command? And we're going to see more of that next week. These are wonderful and deep truths here in the words of Jesus. And what's the result of these words? What's the result of these wonderful and deep truths that Jesus shares? It's how we started. Division. Division. Because who speaks like this? Who says these kinds of things? Jesus is either insane or he's divine. How can you know? Listen to his voice. Listen to his voice. I'll close with this. We already heard part of Ezekiel 34, that rebuke to the shepherds of Israel. Remember now, Ezekiel's written 600 some years before the birth of Christ. Now later on in that same chapter, after rebuking the religious leaders, God says this, behold, I, God, I myself will search for my sheep and will seek them out. I will rescue them from all places where they have been scattered. I will bring them into their own land. I myself will be the shepherd of my sheep, and I myself will make them lie down, declares the Lord God. I will seek the lost, and I will bring back the strayed, and I will bind up the injured, and I will strengthen the weak. You hear it? It's very clear, right? God himself is going to be the shepherd of his people. But then he continues, and I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them. He shall feed them and be their shepherd. So is the shepherd God, or is the shepherd David? Is the shepherd divine, or is the shepherd human? Yes, both. Only one person can make the claim to be the good shepherd. Only Jesus Christ, the God-man, can say with full conviction and authority, I am the good shepherd. Do you know his voice? Are you following him? Is he your shepherd? He laid down his life for you so that you would receive an abundant, eternal life with him. There is no other way to God but through the door of Jesus Christ. And so today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Whoever comes to him, he will never cast out. How do you know if you're one of his sheep? It's because you come to him. And if you come to him, he will never cast you out. He's the good shepherd, after all. The only question is he your shepherd?
We would like to thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. This podcast is a ministry of Victory Baptist Church in Hermiston, Oregon. You can find us at 193 East Main Street in Hermiston, Oregon, 97838, or on the web at yourvictory.org.